Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Goodbye Columbus by Philip Roth. This was Roth's debut book, the title novella and 5 short stories that won him a National Book Award at an extraordinarily young age. So I wanted to revisit this book because frankly, the last time I read Goodbye Columbus, I was about the same age as the protagonist, Neil Klugman. So I wanted to come back a little more than a dozen years later and find out, okay, how does this book fit into the scope of Roth's writing? What are the features in Goodbye Columbus that point the way towards who Roth will develop into as a writer? And frankly, does the book hold up? Does it stand on its own? Is it worth revisiting? So I reread it this weekend, and there are some features that really stood out. So in this video, I want to focus on the title novella Goodbye Columbus. I'll make another one for the short stories because they're worth spending time with as well and revisiting. But in Goodbye Columbus, the features that jump out are, first of all, the voice. It's a first-person voice. Roth's voice is already developing. It's not quite there. It'll become more confident, more sarcastic, frankly, tinged with acid. It'll become more narcissistic. But here, he has that sense of humor, this ability to look at our world through a lens of irony, to see what's beneath the surface, to see the hypocrisy that so many people exist within. And so that voice is present right on these pages, right from the off. It's also a book that is just filled with Roth's love of his home, Newark. There's a way in which this book is a little bit like going and spending time at a park or walking down a street. There is so much memory, a tree that he's climbed, a bench he's sat down on, the way that light, falls at a certain angle. And it all is just breathing on these pages. It really feels like he's gone home, he's walking through the city and almost talking and telling us the story as he wanders through his town. There's a feature to it that really does recall what James Joyce would do with Dubliners, where he's just absolutely in love with the place he grew up in, even when the memories aren't happy. And then finally, there's an understated feature to Roth, which is that he was an incredible reader. Even when he was not at his best as a writer, he was always an incredible reader. And so the way he would take influences and refract them in his writing and spill them out in different ways and in fresh ways was one of his best hallmarks as a writer. And it's here on these pages. Frankly, he's refracting a little less because he hasn't developed his own voice fully yet. And so it's interesting to see how those influences come through. So I want to spend some time in this book. We're given Neil Klugman, who's a young man. He's graduated from college, a public university, and he's working a somewhat dead-end job as a librarian. And he's one summer, he sees another young woman over at the pool, and he just has this almost James Joyce style epiphany where he falls for her. He wants to call her up on the phone and have this stammering conversation to try and introduce himself, make a connection through his cousin who's a friend of hers, or at least an acquaintance of hers, and be able to connect with her because he wants to spend time with her. And the book explores the way that their relationship flourishes over the course of a single summer. Now there are subplots. How does Neil deal with his aunt and uncle? And that sort of gives this side of the working class, secular Jewish experience that Roth is getting at. But that's a subplot. There's a subplot at the library that sort of really just exists to humanize Neil, I think, more than anything. Primarily, it's about Neil and Brenda. What is their relationship like? And that's another key feature of Roth, where there is this almost carnal obsession that he develops in later books. So let's read a first sample. We sat down on a bank of grass slanted enough for us to lean back without really leaning. From the angle, it seemed as though we were preparing to watch some celestial event, the christening of a new star, the inflation to full size of a half-ballooned moon. Brenda zipped and unzipped the cover while she spoke. For the first time, she seemed edgy. Her edginess coaxed mine back, and so we were ready now for what, magically, it seemed we might be able to get by without, a meeting. And so that there's a bit of language there that Roth would not always use in his novels. Later on, that passage ends, we had to take too many steps to keep the approach from being awkward, but we pursued the impulse and kissed. I felt her hand on the back of my neck, and so I tugged her towards me, too violently perhaps, and slid my own hands across the side of her body and around to her back. I felt the wet spots on her shoulder blades, and beneath them, I'm sure of it, a faint fluttering, as though something stirred, so deep in her breast, so far back it could make itself felt through her shirt. It was like the fluttering of wings, tiny wings no bigger than her breasts. The smallness of the wings did not bother me. It would not take an eagle to carry me up those lousy 180 feet that make summer nights so much cooler in Short Hills than they are in Newark. And so we have these ways that Roth is sort of drawing on the language of John Cheever, Henry James, those types of writers, writers that he wouldn't necessarily always revisit as he grew in confidence and sort of a stature as a writer and found who he wanted to be. But here we see, who has he been spending time reading? The dialogue in the book, particularly with Neil's aunt and uncle or with Brenda's parents, recalls the type of dialogue writers like Bernard Malamud would write, where we have little aspects of Yiddish or Hebrew popping out, that there are these working class Jewish characters who have this proud sense of identity and don't really care that their language and their vocabulary isn't as developed as that of their children who have received a higher education. And so that's all coming through within the book. A later passage has, "We spent the rest of the afternoon in the water. There were 8 of those long lines painted down the length of the pool. And by the end of the day, I think we had parked for a while in every lane, close enough to the dark stripes to reach out and touch them. We came back to the chairs now and then and sang hesitant, clever, nervous, gentle dithyrambs about how we were beginning to feel towards one another. Actually, we did not have the feelings we had said until we had spoke them. At least I didn't. To phrase them was to invent them and own them. We whipped our strangeness and newness into a froth that resembled love, and we dared not play too long with it, talk too much of it, or it would flatten and fizzle away. So we moved back and forth from chairs to water, from talk to silence. And considering my unshakable edginess with Brenda and the high walls of ego that rose, buttresses and all, between her and her knowledge of herself, we managed pretty well." And there is this beautiful way that Roth is capturing that sense that we have when we're young, when we're adolescents or in our 20s, or that we are able to recapture in moments where we feel young again, where something feels fresh and new. And we're hesitantly figuring out what is the language for this sensation. David Foster Wallace has written about the idea that there are these aspects of experience and human experience that we describe as expressions because there's no way to actually precisely articulate them. So we kind of all grope around blindly around the same elephant to agree that this is sort of generally what we're feeling when we talk about this. And Roth is capturing that with this beautiful language in Goodbye Columbus. And it's something that I don't think I appreciated when I first read the book. And we see how Brenda and Neil's relationship changes. We see how they begin to have their first encounters, the physical intimacy that grows, the carnal obsession that would sort of shadow Roth throughout his long career. But we also see these other features, the hints of the dark side. The way that Roth would later on build up a character to sort of just overawe everyone else and just annihilate all the straw men and all the straw arguments that could be, mustered against, this brilliant and erudite character he could draw and craft. And that's hinted here, particularly when Neil tries to convince Brenda that she needs to acquire a diaphragm so that they can continue to spend time together at night. And then the way that sort of becomes a Chekhov's diaphragm in a way. I won't spoil that part of the book. But it is a work that is much gentler, I think, than some of his later works would become. There is a nice little subplot about Neil working at the library and a young boy who comes in who's African American who wants to look at the art books in the library and look at the different paintings and ask questions about them, and is particularly taken with a volume of Gauguin's paintings and the way that Neil sort of doesn't want to let anybody else check out that book, so that this boy, who he doesn't even really talk to except about, here's where the art section is, here's where the Gauguin book is, that he has this way where he's almost like defending this boy's right to spend time in the library and to enjoy the book. And the boy refuses to check the book out because he's worried that if he takes it home, it might get damaged. And so that interaction really does humanize Neil, and it's important that Roth puts those passages in right when Neil starts to become most demanding in his relationship with Brenda. But another feature that's here is the humor and the sarcasm, because Brenda's family is much wealthier. Her father has a company where he provides kitchens and sinks, and he has been able to use some war contracts to really build up a whole wealth of treasure chest. And he's paying for his kids to go to college and, finding success there. And we see the unhappiness that exists there. At a wedding, we see how the Mr. Potemkin's brother is just barely making ends meet as this sort of traveling salesman, a light bulb salesman. And we see the way that he's so proud of his integrity, even though he's poor. And Mr. Potemkin is just barely even speaking to his brother at this wedding. The way that there's this distance between them is something that Roth's commenting on, sort of the consumerism that he sees. Additionally, Brenda's brother Ron is certainly someone who's peaked early. And that's something Roth would do with sometimes with protagonists. But here he has Ron, and the whole reveal around what Goodbye Columbus actually means and what the Columbus record is quite funny. It's laughing quite loudly at Ron and at folks like Ron who have this sense of always wanting to recapture, this moment of glory that we had when we were young. And I've preferred certainly in life to seize what's next and enjoy that next moment while appreciating the memories and not dwelling too much on them. So there are features of the book that I think really do stand out and that really work. So I would recommend, if you haven't read any Roth, it's a good place to jump out. Letting Go, his first full-length novel, is much more of that long prosodic writing. It's very different from anything else he would ever write. He was under the huge influence of Saul Bellow when he was writing his early books. Certainly, as I had mentioned, a writer like Malamud comes in, particularly, as I said, the dialogue that comes through. Additionally, I think this and Letting Go are where Roth is most clearly influenced by reading a lot of Henry James and finding the best aspects of James to pull out and appreciate. A contemporary of Roth's was Richard Stern, who wrote the book Other Men's Daughters, and there's so much about this that feels like it could have been a Roth novel. It's just a different tone, a different voice. The subject matter is there, though. I think there are aspects of Goodbye Columbus that really remind me of contemporary work, frankly, from Nigeria, Cyprian Akwensi's People of the City. Roth would later come back with a vengeance with Portnoy's Complaint, but his novella The Breast is a great rereading of Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And one of the features I think that works best with Roth is when he's allowing himself to sort of get out of his own way and find the voice for a story, the voice for human emotion and connection. And The Deep Love of Newark is something that comes through in American Pastoral, a much later book, written almost half a lifetime later, and yet showing the same appreciation for Newark and an ability to sort of get out of his own singular experience to think about this much larger whole community experience. He would later develop a strong friendship with Milan Kundera, and Laughable Loves by Kundera feels very close to what Roth is writing about. Harold Brodkey would be another contemporary with his stories in First Love and Other Sorrows. And Brodkey was someone who, unlike Roth, couldn't necessarily put pen to paper or, typewriter key to the page and produce novels. Brodkey famously would spend years writing and revising and rewriting passages from the same novel that he never really quite published. The tone of Breaking and Entering by Joy Williams is very, very close to Goodbye Columbus. Additionally, I was reminded of This Side of Paradise from F. Scott Fitzgerald, another sort of late college novel, one that shows sort of signals of where the writer's going to go, even if the writer hasn't quite reached that point yet. Something like The Post Office Girl from Stefan Zweig feels comparable. Additionally, I would say the toxic nature of relationships that Roth sees is very close to Aloberto Moravia, particularly in Contempt. More recent work might be Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. And certainly Rabbit Run from John Updike feels very close to the sense of being home, being in this place, the interactions between men and women that are, frankly, the men are too insistent and unkind and selfish. And then finally, a work that reminds me of Roth and sort of Goodbye Columbus would be The Squid and the Whale. Noah Baumbach, it sort of takes his own view of literature, his own view of literary antecedents of growing up in a neighborhood and in a community and sort of finding one's path, finding one's voice, falling in and out of love. And so it feels just very close to who Roth was. So let me know. I'll probably be putting up another video on Roth at some time in the future, and I hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.